Well, you've always wondered what the heck the thing was for. Now, the force majeure clause is probably going to end up saving your skin. This is the Wedding Industry Law Podcast, a podcast dedicated to wedding professionals just trying to keep it legal. And now, your host, attorney Rob Schenk. Hello. My name is Rob Schenk. I am an attorney, and I will be your host for this, the very first episode of the Wedding Industry Law Podcast. It's about 11:40 p.m. on Sunday, March 14th. I wanted to go ahead and get this episode recorded and out by Monday morning because this has been the weekend of the coronavirus. Unfortunately, a lot of things went down this past week. I believe it accelerated exponentially, and now we're looking at a national emergency. Prior to that, there were a few states that declared emergencies, a few cities and localities that declared emergencies, which prompted, I'm sure, thousands, if not tens of thousands of cancellations of weddings and events. So that leaves us with several questions that we are going to try to tackle on this episode. I will skip the housekeeping matters, introducing myself, introducing what this podcast is all about, because I think that this topic deserves kind of the front seat. So hopefully we can deal with the coronavirus and canceled events. And then at the end, I can tell you a little bit more about myself and about what I foresee for this podcast, because hopefully this will not just be the only episode. Hopefully this will come out regularly. But at any rate, as I mentioned at the very top of the show, there is a very special term that is probably in your contracts. You've always read it. Obviously, it's in a foreign language, so it probably stands out. Or maybe it doesn't stand out for all the people that are multilingual. But that is the force majeure clause. The force majeure clause is going to be the most apt term when an event or a wedding is canceled because of a pandemic, because of the coronavirus. And this is why. The force majeure term in your contract is in there for the purposes of eliminating either party, you or the client, either party, the liability in the event that the wedding or the event is canceled due to an act of God, a higher force. So if a tornado levels the building that the event's supposed to take place in, if a strike prevents the transit from going and people can't take the transit to get to wherever it is, like if it's a train going to a mountain resort, whatever the case may be, an event that is completely and utterly out of the control of the parties as a force majeure event, and it it prevents either party from suing the other for not completing the services. So the wedding professional can't sue the client for not showing up, and the client cannot sue the vendor for not showing up if there is in fact a force majeure event, an act of God. So again, neither party, the aggrieved party, is not allowed to sue the other for breach of contract for failure to show up in the event that there's an actual force majeure event. So typically what happens when you have a force majeure clause in the contract and a force majeure event does take place, typically the parties will go back to status quo ante. They're going to go back to where they were had the contract not been made. Now, again, and I'll give this disclaimer multiple times during the duration of this podcast and this series of podcasts, but contract law is state derivative. Every state is different. every state, how they handle force majeure clauses, even if it's written in the contract, if it's not written in the contract, how states interpret it are all different. So I'm speaking from a 40,000 foot view. It's a general idea. So where you're at might not be what I'm talking about. So at any rate, but whenever there is a force majeure event, generally how the law operates is that everybody goes back to where they were. So no one is pretty much going to be allowed to make a profit. No one is going to be forced to provide services, and therefore you're not going to be able to get the profit from it. In some instances, you are able to keep expenses as a professional. Some instances not. These type of things need to be spelled out in the contract. So again, force majeure prevents either party from suing the other for a breach of contract. It makes everybody go back to where they were before the contract was signed. So expenses sometimes get kept, sometimes it does not, but the money goes back to the client. Everybody goes back to square one. If the event cannot be rescheduled, that's the next hurdle. So sometimes force majeure events are those where there will never be another event, or there won't be an event that would include you as the wedding professional. Sometimes the force majeure event will end. In the times in which the force majeure event will end in a reasonable amount of time, then the parties don't go back to status quo ante. They continue to move forward with the contract. Sometimes that happens, sometimes that doesn't. In the instances of floods or tornadoes where like literally the building is leveled, it's not going to happen. So at any rate, the next question would be, what truly are acts of God? Okay. Typically in your boilerplate force majeure clause, you have things like riot, hurricane, tornado, civil unrest sometimes, strikes, labor strikes. I worked for a French law firm for a couple of years, and so we had to go over there a bunch. And if it was Tuesday, they were on strike. But at any rate, that would be a force majeure event if it prevented the people from completing the task, completing the contract. So labor strikes, this type of thing. What is not an act of God would be something that is within your control. So the hard drive to your computer goes down. You, as a performer, get the flu. Things that are foreseeably within your control. I know that we don't control the hard drive in our computer, but we maintain custody and control over it, and we should, the parties are assuming that you're going to be able to have a computer that works. So it's truly something that is beyond the realm of the ability for you to actually control. So that's always going to beg the question. My interpretation of what's it's in the control of the party is different from the client's. So in the example of like a flood or a blizzard, something like that, a blizzard for somebody in Atlanta, at least in my mind, might be different from somebody that is in Minneapolis or Chicago. Okay. 1 inch of snow is going to shut down the city here in Atlanta. That's where I am actually principled. I don't know why I just said that. I have an office, I have a principal office. I guess that's what I was trying to say. I have an office in Atlanta. So my idea of what a force majeure clause is or force majeure event is different than maybe what yours are. So depending on where you are regionally or where you are in your state, it might behoove you to really go into defining what a force majeure event is. So it's not uncommon to have like a neutral party, typically like a government agency or a department, kind of be the arbiter of whether or not there's a force majeure event. So I've seen contracts where if the school systems in the county where the event is going to be held are out the day before or the day after, that's a force majeure event, or that decides whether or not the inclement weather constitutes a force majeure event. You also have if flights coming in and out of a particular airport have been terminated. That can be a force majeure event if there's a hurricane or whatever inclement weather. If the temperature goes over 110 degrees with the heat index, things of this nature where you're not just saying that, if, there's a heat warning or whatever, like you're literally having a definition of what the force majeure event is. Now, again, or maybe not again, maybe for the first time. For the first time, you don't want your contract to be the riot act. So that's why typically these force majeure clauses are kind of simple. It's 3 or 4 sentences. You don't want to, have the, what I've been describing as like the neutral party determining, the parties agreeing that neutral agency will determine if it's a force majeure event for every single thing. Maybe the most common thing in your area, like I said, like hurricanes, heat, wildfires, these type of things. If these are continually coming up, and they probably are on the time of climate change, you would have that addressed in the force majeure clause and not leave it up to the interpretation of a judge down the road whether or not your event the problem is an actual truly a force majeure event or not. So using the contract itself to define the force majeure clause or the force majeure event for typical events in your area is probably the smartest thing to do. Well, that's great, Rob. How am I supposed to know that we were going to have a national emergency and a worldwide pandemic? Is a pandemic a force majeure event? For the lucky few of you that have pandemic defined in your force majeure clause, congratulations. That's already laid out for you. For everybody else, whether or not a pandemic is a force majeure event, which frees you as the wedding professional from liability of being a defendant in a breach of contract action, will depend. I think that states are different, i.e. the jurisdictions are different. Even within the states, you can get a judge that believes that pandemics are hoaxes. You can get a judge that believes that we're all going to die. It's going to depend from the state to the city to the judge that you're in. Okay. I will say this, and again, the purpose of this podcast is not to provide you with legal advice. I don't want you to take a video of this, go into your court and go, Rob told me this. Okay. I'm giving you general information here. So do not rely solely on this podcast. But typically, once there is a edict from the Department of Health and Human Services or from the president saying this is a national emergency, we are advising you to stay home, or your governor is saying that, or your mayor or the city council are saying that either we don't recommend it, or in some instances, I believe that as of this afternoon, New York, the New York City mayor, I believe, is saying we are forbidding events of over 300 or 400 people. I think that happened in Miami, but I could be wrong. But these are going to be things that happen that would tend to favor the argument that the coronavirus is a force majeure event and would free you from the liability of not going to the event and fulfilling your duties under the contract with the client. Again, everything is different. Every jurisdiction is different, but typically, if a pandemic is going to be a force majeure event, then almost certainly it'll be one because the mayor has said so, the governor said so, and now the president has said so that it's a national emergency. Of course, it doesn't help when you have certain state representatives, certain members of the administration saying, please go out to the restaurants, please go out to the events and have fun. do that kind of thing, that would tend to show that it is not a force majeure event that we're in currently. But these would be the questions. These would be the allegations that you would need to refute. These would be the facts that you would need to find if you were going to argue that you should not be able to show up to an event in a month or 2 months or whenever it is because of the coronavirus. The coronavirus would need to be decided as a force majeure event to free you from that liability. So I guess at the end of the day, this is not extremely helpful for the events right now, because you've theoretically have already signed those contracts months ago, maybe years ago. And so you're looking for some guidance. But I would say this: I've had a few phone calls from wedding professionals who are being threatened already. Wedding professional, you must show up to this event next week or tomorrow or 3 weeks from now. And if you don't, I'm going to sue you. So I've had at least a few calls from clients worried about this because this is happening to them right now, and it might be happening to you. So what I say to them is everything that I've just told you now. But also, I feel like in my heart of hearts that if you were to fast forward to the trial where that client that wanted you to show up in the middle of a pandemic has sued you, that person has to say, in spite of the fact that the president has declared this an emergency, in spite of the fact that my governor, my mayor, my city council has decided that this is an emergency, despite the fact that all these other states and all these other cities are trying to flatten the curve, doing all these things, I think that it was okay to have my event, and therefore I should get money for breach of contract because this wedding professional didn't show up. I think that that would be a hard argument to make in front of that judge. I'm not saying that you're going to win that. I'm just saying that, to me, that really makes the person not look too good. That we're, at least a certain amount of people in this country are doing what they can to reduce the risk of spread. And here is a person that is commanding you to take the risk of contracting a virus, an infection, not a virus, an infection that could potentially harm people that you love. So I think that would be a hard place to put. That's a hard place to be for a plaintiff. It's a good place to be for a defendant. To the extent that you ever want to be a defendant, it's kind of a bummer. But that's what I think about. So, to the extent that you have to respond to people that are demanding that you show up in the middle of a pandemic, I would just explain to these things. You can go to the CDC website and look at the information regarding infection transmission and why it's important that these things, why it's important that events are suspended. I would point, if you're in a jurisdiction, if you're in a city state that has declared an emergency, I would make sure that you have that information available and show it to them and give all of the reasons why. Make sure that you have provided a record, a thorough record of why you are not going to come through with this at this event. Okay. As per most force majeure causes, and as I stated earlier, you may attempt to say, okay, well, we can't do it this time, but I will make sure that we'll reschedule it to the extent that we can. You do the best you can to mitigate the issue. So, I think that's it. So at the end of the day, moving forward with your business, if you want to truly knock this out so that it doesn't have to happen again, that you want to be able to point to your contract and say, I am not showing up someplace where I have a risk of contracting something that I could give to my grandparents, then you should implement, or I would recommend that you implement, depending on what state you're in, the force majeure clause that defines when a pandemic or something like that would rise to the level to which it becomes a force majeure event. You dictate in that term in the contract, in the force majeure clause, whether or not there's a time period for rescheduling that event, what happens to the money that you may have put into the event, whether or not the client is going to take the risk of you keeping the expenses, and make sure that when you are signing up that client, that you actually go through every single term in your contract, including the force majeure clause, and talk about why that's important. Although I think that for the next couple of years, that's all we're going to talk about. It's just one of those things. But I think that's all I have to say about that for now. If you have any questions about force majeure clauses, or any subjects that you would like to see about the coronavirus, force majeure, whatever, you can certainly shoot me an email at rob@weddingindustrylaw.com. That's rob@weddingindustrylaw.com. And I'm going to use the remainder of this episode to talk about this podcast. I think where it's going to go, what we can do with it, you and me. So yeah, this is episode 1. It took me all day to do a video on the coronavirus for my other line of work. And then, so I started working on this podcast at 10, 11 o'clock at night. And of course, I can't figure out how anything works. I've got a fancy microphone. I got a fancy mixer, but at the end of the day, I think I'm using my webcam at this point to record this thing. But I envision this podcast to be of a little bit more higher quality in terms of the audio. So please forgive me. Hopefully that's not why you would not listen in the future. But hopefully that will get better with time. I'm also hoping to continue to make this a video podcast as well. So I'm hoping that the camera is picking me up right now. So you can watch this on my YouTube channel. So just go into YouTube, Wedding Industry Law. It should be there somewhere. I'm not quite sure what the credentials are, the login for the Wedding Industry Law YouTube page, but if you just go to weddingindustrylaw.com, it's there. So I think that I'm going to try to do episodes where I just talk about a particular topic, could do some hot takes. And I want to try to make this weekly because of the coronavirus and because of how I wanted to get this episode out while it was hot. I'm about 3 weeks early, so that's why this is all kind of half-ass. Because I imagine that I would have an extra month to prepare and get everything ready. So, but I want to try to make this a weekly thing. Probably Mondays. I think that's the best. So Mondays, it'll probably be like, 15, 25 minutes, talking about all things legal with running a wedding business. Again, if you have ideas, hey man, throw them at me. rob@weddingindustrylaw.com. Shoot me an email. What would be really awesome is that one day I would love to be able to do a live show. So you could either call me like WKRP in Cincinnati. That's a deep cut. If you're under 50, you probably don't get that. But that would be really cool. I want to try to do that as well. So that's coming in the future. But at the minimum, we're going to try to get this as a weekly 20, 25 minute podcast about wedding industry law, everything about running a wedding business legally. Yeah, I think that's about it. And if you don't, I didn't talk about myself. I guess that's good that I've said that for the very, very last. I am an attorney. I've been an attorney for about 12 years. I have represented wedding industry professionals for pretty much most of that time. I operate and edit a blog called weddingindustrylaw.com. It's kind of fallen off for the last couple of years, but I'm hoping that this podcast is a way to kind of rejuvenate the site. But at any rate, I've done thousands of contracts for wedding industry professionals. I'm licensed to practice law in California, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, and New York. So if you happen to be in those places, you can give me a call. But I also operate a wedding contract template website called wedforms.com. That's WEDFORMZ.com. You can purchase templates for a flat rate. So, wow, this is interesting. So this is like so spur of the moment that I don't have anything prepared. Like this was not even funny. Like, this is like, please do not judge me by the first episode. Let me just put it to you that way. Hey, how about this? There we go. Hopefully that comes through and not just silence, but that's supposed to be a laughing sound effect. There we go. That's an applause. Okay. So had stuff planned, didn't work out. At any rate, I think that's where I'm going to sign off. So I appreciate you listening if you've made it this far. Hopefully you'll be back again. Maybe it'll be next Monday. Hopefully it'll be next Monday. We'll be talking about something else. And with that, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.